Conquer fan, what's going on? It's Ty Palms and Coach Jared. We're here back with another Conquer chat or YouTube chat, I should call it. Um, we're gonna have some fun with this one. Right now, the Olympics is going on. Really cool story, actually. A girl from this town, Pelham, New York. She's a Olympic swimmer. She went to high school
Mhm.
over here, went to UVA. She silver medaled just 2 days ago, and she's actually live right now. And NBC is down the street. They got there's a movie theater down the street, like a town movie theater, and they NBC is there, and there's a live coverage of it, which is pretty neat.
That's very cool.
Yeah, I actually don't know her name, which is unfortunate, but she's young. Like she's like I think 21 or 22. She just graduated college, I think. Like absolute
Mhm.
stud. And it's pretty cool because she's actually like produced out of here, which is Pelham, New York isn't like a big town or anything like that. I mean, we're right outside New York City, so there's definitely like talent in the area, but not like Pelham specifically. You know what I mean?
Sure.
Um, have you been watching the Olympics at all?
I've been catching the headlines. Some of the things that pop up on social media, like um, there was the one guy who was like 60 something years old, came back to do the Olympics. I think it was ping pong or something like that, which I don't care. Like have the reflexes for how fast that game goes.
Yeah,
And then the other one has been I think he's Israeli shooter who just kind of like standing there off to the side and
Turkish, I think.
oh, Turkish. Okay. I apologize. But anyways, like everybody else has their fancy
Yeah,
gear on. He's just
yeah,
like, Clint Eastwood style turning and
it's a
shooting. Like, I
normal.
love
Yeah,
it.
it's pretty badass. I just saw that one too. That's the only reason I know that he's Turkish. I literally saw
Yeah.
it like 10 minutes ago. I was like, oh, that's neat. Yeah, Olympics is pretty cool. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I just watched Simone Biles for the past hour actually, and her gymnastics routine. It's like the equivalent of Matt Fraser at the CrossFit Games.
Mhm.
It's like she makes them look like they're not even Olympic level athletes. It is ridiculous. She's doing these flips and landing perfectly. And like you see her kind of slip up and you're like, ooh. And then you watch the other people go and you're like, oh, that was like not actually slipping up. Like these girls are slipping up every time they do something. She's just
Mhm.
nailing perfect routines and has like one hiccup. It's nuts.
Yeah,
Nuts.
the gymnastic stuff is really fascinating to me. It's just the amount of body awareness. Like I can do a half half-ass backflip, right? And I don't know how they're flipping in the air and twisting and rotating, and they still know where they're at in space that they can land, with their feet together, touching. And I lose space where I'm at just doing one single thing like
She's doing flips on beams.
that. I
I'm like,
know.
what? Yeah, it's sick. I really have enjoyed watching that. That's the only thing I've been really tuning into is and swimming and the gymnastics, but it's been cool.
Mhm.
Um, with that being said, guys, today we're gonna kind of stem off the Olympics, and as I'm assuming most of you who are watching this know, the Olympics is once every 4 years, right? So these athletes have to peak in 4 years. So just kind of think about that, right? Like you have a whole training cycle, and it's all about being able to qualify for this event that is taking place in 4 years and then have your best performance at that competition, which is very different than, a traditional setting of sport where, you might have one big competition at the end of every single year, or you might have multiple big competitions throughout the year. And because of that, training cycles look very different. So today, what we want to talk about is how you might program for your clients in the sport of CrossFit if their goal was to peak for a competition that was 4 years away. And we'll assume that these athletes are on the younger side, so they have lots of time and to like grow and can potentially compete at multiple Olympics rather than the person who's going to be one and done, because that also could change some factors there. But regardless, once every 4 years, starting at a young age, I'll kick it off with a couple of things that I'll think about that I'd be thinking about, and then we'll stem off that. So first and foremost, the difference that I think about when I'm thinking about my clients, when I'm having them train for multiple competitions potentially throughout the year, even if they're not big competitions, maybe some local ones. I think the biggest hiccup is balancing the act of, hey, I need to get you better for 2 years from now because that's how long it's going to take for you to be able to maybe compete at a semifinal event versus I know you want to be able to PR your snatch within the next 3 months or you're going to think we're not doing the right things, right? So every coach who is a coach who has multiple athletes or any athletes of that matter knows they have to keep their clients happy to a certain extent, which means short-term progress versus, okay, it's great if they can do that now, but if I can prolong this progression, I'll probably be able to get them to have more long-term success. And that's the first thing that I kind of think about. How about yourself, Jared?
Yeah, it's it is a juggling act. Um, you need to be able to show progress to the athlete. They need to be able to feel like they're making progress in some avenue with some type of metric, whether it's weight or time or reps. And it really is difficult because we all have that notion that we want to see results, quickly. We want to have things, at our door the next day through Amazon or whatever the case may be. And so part of what the coach does is looking at, like, okay, here's the athlete right now in their current state. Where do I think they can be 6 months from now? And that's where like a lot of the planning stems from. I want them to be at this time, at this weight 6 months from now. But that training might look vastly different than a little 4 week segment where they still want to know that they're making progress. They still want to be able to see, tying their PR, hitting um, higher percentage lifts with more consistency. So, like you said, it very much is a juggling act of want and need for sure.
Yeah. Yep, exactly. So when I think about the sport of CrossFit, right? We have a few modalities that we really need to get good at. We have gymnastics, we have like we can call it Olympic lifting, but let's just characterize as like barbell strength, and then we have our monostructural, right? And we all know, I think, that strength takes a lot longer to develop than something like the aerobic system, at least the aerobic system that's needed for a CrossFit athlete,
Mhm.
right? So with that being said, I think that also just kind of plays into a factor about how you might develop an athlete. Like, how much time would you be focusing on improving someone's aerobic capacity versus their strength? And let's just assume this person is equally good at both and they're not very good at both, right? We want to get them ready in 4 years to be at the games. A lot of that time should be probably, in my opinion, focusing on developing as much strength as humanly possible that's needed to compete in the sport, which means we might not have to train as much on the aerobic side of things so that we can make that progress quicker. Now, alongside that, we're obviously thinking about movement economy and things of that nature, but you'll see a lot of athletes, let's just take Matt Frazier as one of them, who started with a massive Olympic lifting background, didn't do any CrossFit, any kind of conditioning, and then was able to come into the sport and very quickly compete at the highest level, and then ultimately ended up being the best. So that's just something that I know that I would absolutely be thinking about is like, hey, we're not going to be doing a lot of CrossFit. We're not going to be doing a lot of conditioning. We need to get you really strong and really efficient with a barbell. That's what I'd be thinking.
Yeah, I 100% agree. You know, I always tell people like strength takes years, conditioning takes weeks.
Yep.
And that's not to have to work at necessarily the highest level, but to have
Yeah.
an adequate proficient level, right?
Yep.
And so in my mind, it would be 100% prioritized toward strength. And then I also made the note of like being highly technical. So,
Mm-hmm.
at 70, 80%, which is in all honesty, if somebody's trying to get stronger and we're looking 4 years down the road, I don't need to have them hitting anything above 90 anytime soon. It gets all in like that 70, 85% range, and everything should look absolutely perfect every single time, no matter how many reps, no matter the fatigue. And that's the base that I would want to build from the very start, whether it's snatch, back squat, front squat, all of those things. And I would still take the same approach with the gymnastics because from my perspective, I think gymnastics are very challenging to develop. Like people can learn to kip handstand push-ups and to handstand walk, but not necessarily like you would expect a gymnast to, where like they're walking in a perfectly straight line, which again, that's their sport. It's not necessarily ours, but we always want to work toward the highest level of technical proficiency that we can. That way, as fatigue sets in, you go from A plus quality to A minus quality. Great, that's fine. We're still moving exceptionally well.
Yeah.
But yeah, that would be the big focus from my perspective, at least for the first large block of time.
Yeah, no, I like what you brought up the gymnastics there on the movement efficiency side of things, because I think what's really, there's a couple things that came to mind when you said that. And the first is like, okay, if we do want this person to be able to, let's say, let's just call it, we're in April and we know that the Open is going to be in what, March, right? And this is
Yeah.
a new time athlete, and they want to compete in the Open this year, right? They want to put their name on a leaderboard. They want to be able to measure progress year after year to see that they're getting closer and closer to their goals. There does come a time and place where you're like, we can't just do the handstand walk in isolation and try to make it perfect. We have to get them comfortable doing this under some level of fatigue. And what's going to happen is form will break down in that setting. And ultimately, they're going to have to learn how to move in that setting, right? Where since that has to actually occur, you have to rush the potential to actually build in isolation as proficiently as possible, like you said, which I think becomes a really big issue, right? That's what we see in Olympic lifting with a lot of CrossFitters who start CrossFit and that's where they learn Olympic lifting. Even though they're doing it in isolation a couple times a week, they're doing so much barbell cycling and they're doing it under fatigue that they start building movement patterns that are actually inefficient for the movement itself. And it carries over to how they lift under a isolated setting for strength. Where if you take an Olympic lifter who's been doing it for 4 or 5 years, they have that technique memory that when they do a 1RM, it looks really good. And then when they have to go cycle a barbell under fatigue, they're able to manipulate the barbell in a way that allows them to move better and faster, but they could still go back to that 1RM and look and move well. So that's a big thing, is that like if you spend years developing technical efficiency, your body knows that with its eyes closed how to do it. But when you're mixing both at the same time and that's where you're learning it, I think that's where we start to see a lot of technique breakdown and why we start to see a lot of technique breakdown.
No, I definitely agree there. And like you said, it comes with the balance of, you know, short term um short term progress, short term outcomes versus long term outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
And that can be a tough conversation to have with athletes, especially when like, hey, you can do strict handstand push-ups and you look okay right now. I'd like to see you get to a point where you could do X amount of handstand push-ups as opposed to where you're at currently.
Yep.
But because a workout necessitates you need to do those after, a 400-meter run or some intervals on the echo bike. And then we start seeing like the overextension, like the almost like a push-up style strict handstand push-up, which we know isn't the most efficient way for them to do that because of that excess range of motion. And then because they get so used to doing that with fatigue, that becomes their go-to. That becomes their default as opposed to what, a high quality rep looks like. And that's
Mm-hmm.
always the battle with a coach. Hey, we want you to move really, really well. We want you to do it fast. We want you to improve. But if we let too many other things leak in at the same time, we're going to see a degradation of your movement quality, which ultimately could, we get progress up front, but that means we stall our progress in the long. Another thing that you mentioned, which it's a me thing, and I know it's 100% a me thing, but I don't personally like newer athletes bouncing the barbell off their legs when they're doing cleans. Like,
Yeah, rebounding.
yeah, yeah, people get mad at me about that. Like, everybody's doing it so fast. I said, I 100% agree. It is much faster. But if your hang clean isn't technically proficient, then we're just training things that's not going to make you better in the long run. So you're going to be blunted by that point that you can't use momentum to create speed on the barbell. But yeah, that you mentioned some of those things, and that's what popped up in my brain.
It's funny you bring up the hang power clean and the rebounding. You know what's pretty interesting is that like when you go to a lot of these competitions, they got short bars, and I don't know if you've ever tried rebounding with a short bar before, but it feels like someone's taking a bat to your leg, and people don't end up doing it anyway. They're like, it's not even worth it. I'm not rebounding. So like, if you're someone who's in the class setting rebounding, thinking like that's what you're going to be able to do in a live competition, you probably aren't going to be able to. You're probably going to have to hinge over because of that short bar, or you're going to be walking around with bruises on your thighs for the remainder of the comp, and you can weigh that risk reward. A lot of people learn that the hard way at Wodapalooza for the first time. But yeah, that was a good note. Um, so yeah, so that was a couple things. Now, obviously, like, listen, like, if you want to be good at the sport of CrossFit, you're gonna have to practice the sport of CrossFit, right? We can't just assume, oh, you build Olympic lifting and you build some gymnastics and you do some sort of running, and then all of a sudden they're gonna be great at the sport, right? They do have to spend some time developing. And now also there's a few things that come along with practice of the sport that takes years to develop, like understanding how to pace things, right? Like think about when you first started the sport of CrossFit and then by like a year or 2 years in, like you understood how you should approach workouts and how you should break them up and how long a certain amount of reps at a particular movement was going to take you. So with that being said, like I do think there's still merit in practicing the sport. I just think it would be a lot less. How about yourself?
You mean if we're looking at like this long 4 year type cycle?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, 100%. There's utility in exposure to exactly what it is you're going to be doing, right? You have to practice mixed modal settings. You have to practice some lifting under fatigue. You have to do your gymnastics under fatigue. You have to do all those things in as many variations as you can think of. Um, I think the big thing would be the volume is significantly lower.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously 4 years out, the intensity can be
Yep.
high, but it's just in smaller doses. There's no need to do 10 3-minute intervals of smash yourself into the floor when it's not going to make you that much better in the short term. It's just going to make you
True.
more fatigued, unable to do the training the next day that's going to help benefit you more in the long run.
Yep.
So it's like you're still going to do conditioning. You're not going to omit conditioning just because you're 4 years out. You're still going to do it. Just the level to which you do that is very low. And if we go back, I think it was the last time we talked. You did a great analogy about, and I'll use it again, different faucets running, right? And if we make it really, really simplistic of strength, gymnastics, monostructural work, strength, that thing's running full bore.
Yeah.
Gymnastics is probably pretty close to that. The conditioning is just barely dripping, just enough that it keeps you from being deconditioned, but not at the point where it's, super important because the timeline being so far away. That being said, depending on the athlete, they may really like conditioning. So it may be that, every probably like four, every like 6 to 12 weeks, you give them some smaller doses of conditioning where you turn that valve up a little bit more because that makes them happy and it keeps them focused and energized. And then you kind of give them a little bit of what they want, like we've alluded to before, and back off just so they still keep that buy-in to the program without feeling like they have no say in things, but not so much that it causes the detriment of what the long-term plan looks like.
Yeah, and I mean that's also just like another factor. It's like it's easy for us to be like, yeah, you should never do CrossFit because you don't have to for 4 years out, or like you don't need to do a lot of this or a lot of that. But at the same time, you have to keep athletes mentally in it, right? Like that would be a completely different hurdle, right? Like where to keep an athlete in it for a year, and when they get to compete relatively regularly, is a lot easier than being like you're probably not going to see a competition setting that really matters more than like once every couple years, and it's like damn, like, and because you do have this like fear factor of like, like, am I even good enough? Like, am I gonna even be able to make it? Right? Is this 4 years gonna be a waste of time? Right? Like, and I think that becomes really challenging where like these short gratifications of, oh, I qualified for Wodapalooza, or oh, I qualified for quarterfinals, or oh, I won my local comp, right? It's like it's really nice. Where the
Mhm.
4 years, it's like, damn, like I really hope this is worth it. And to keep someone, especially if they're having like plateaus throughout those 4 years, which they're evidently like absolutely going to see, that would be a different hurdle in itself.
Mhm. So I wrote down this question, and I'm curious what your thoughts are. Um, I what I would like to know, because I don't know, is let's say take a simple sport like track and field, where it's very straightforward, even swimming, where it's like, here's your distance, here's your time, right?
Hmm.
In the course of a 4 year period, how many times do you think they do, let's call it like a mini peak, right? Just kind of like a little evaluation of where their training is at in the course of that 4 years. Do you think they do it annually? Do you think they do it biannually? How many times do you think they actually try to not necessarily peak, but see a high peak amongst their training? And then if you were to do that with a CrossFit athlete, how many times would you do that in that same 4 year setting as well?
So I'll speak more towards like the CrossFit athlete. I mean, I don't know. I don't think I would probably quote unquote peak them more than once a year. Like I mean, even my athletes now who are semifinal athletes, they're not being peaked more than once a year. Like they were technically peaked multiple times because quarterfinals in the North America East, and specifically speaking to those athletes, like they weren't good enough that they could not be peaked for quarterfinals and make semifinals like a shoe in. So they had to be peaked for that, and then we had to deload a little bit and peak again for semis.
Mhm.
And so they're technically peaked twice, but that's within like a 8 week window, right? Whereas if I don't have someone necessarily competing, because when I think about peaking for CrossFit, a lot of that has to do with their conditioning. A lot of it has to do with the conditioning and being able to do, depending upon like if we were peaking, let's just say for the CrossFit Games, like do 13 to 15 events over 4 days, that takes a lot out of an
Mhm.
athlete. Um, and I don't know if the time spent to peak for that and then to deload from that would be worth it when I can think of this 4 year stretch. Um, I that's an interesting thought. That's a really interesting thought because I'm not completely sure as to how I would attack it. You know, if there was like, because there would be stages throughout the 4 years that they probably had to be able to like go and compete to show that they're able to even like move on and try out
Mhm.
for the 4 year championship. We'll call it the Olympics for CrossFit. So they probably would need to be peaked, but like let's just say they didn't. I don't know. I think it would take me. It really would depend upon where the athlete's sitting and like how their progression is going and mentally how they're looking. But I wouldn't see much of a reason to do like a full blown peak because at the end of the day, it's super unhealthy, right? And it's like I can make the other argument though. Like I can make the other argument that like, yeah, but you also need to see how your athlete can respond to that type of training and what happens when they do, because then you can collect feedback for when you actually go to compete for that championship, right? Like if you peak them and it's just terrible, they are way overtrained and they go in there and perform terribly, you now know, okay, we did way too much, or at least at this point in time, this is too much for you to be able to handle and we have to do it differently next time so that you can perform better. And then you do it again and you're like, okay, that was a lot better than last time, but like you still kind of look drained by day 4 or day 3. And then you keep collecting that data over and over again. And then by that 4th year, you're like, dude, I know exactly how to peak this dude. He's going to go in there ready to get after it. And that is also a confidence side of things that would be really nice to have.
So let me add on to that question. Obviously the games are never the same. You never see
Mm-hmm.
any. Well, we've seen like the occasional somewhat repeat event like Murph, but it wasn't never the same exact format. If we were to do that, would you use the same, let's say hypothetical 15 events? That way you could have something a little bit more strategic to compare to, or would you change them into simply, let's say I'll be generic, like instead of a 2K row, you make it the equivalent number for a biker. That way it's still a similar time domain, similar movement, or what would you do there?
Yeah, so really fast. One thing I would make sure I was doing with these athletes is regularly kind of run them through testing assessments just to see that we're moving along the
Hmm?
kind of like we're moving along and progressing, right? So whether that's one arm snatch and 1 mile run or 2 mile run and 30 ring muscles for time, like things like that, just to have some metrics to see, okay, where are they sitting? How are they doing in comparison to how they used to be able to do? But then also having metrics on other athletes and seeing where they currently on and being like, okay, how far are we from them? So that would be happening throughout the year, just to make a point. And then in terms of like if I was to kind of run them through like a mini assessment of the games, let's call it, I think part of the games is the unknowable aspect. And I don't think going in there like being prepared for what you're about to do or knowing times or anything of that nature would be a good way of being able to measure progress in comparison to other athletes. So I would definitely utilize workouts that have been tested before to use it as data and metrics. But at the same time, I wouldn't want them to know what the workouts were. And also, there's just such a factor of like when you're actually at the games competing versus when you're at your gyms doing it, it's so different. And those numbers are going to look completely different. And so it's kind of like this, like, yeah, but it's not there. So it doesn't really matter, in my opinion,
Or, yeah,
you know?
that makes sense. Um, one thing I was thinking about as well is it's kind of a little deviation from where you're at, but in terms of like peaking multiple times, one thing that I would assume, and I don't know how it is for every sport, but in the Olympics, like they have, I'll use track and field as an example. They have their national, right? They have to win to qualify to go, and so technically they are trying to peak, and they weren't that long ago. I would say within the past 6 to 8 weeks. So they are, peaking and then like
Yep.
kind of like you alluded to having a little deload
Yep.
and then trying to peak again. In obviously a much different setting in a new country and things like that. So um, if I were to guess, I would imagine they probably do something similar around the same time frame. Like, okay, the Olympics are going to be in August. We're going to do our quote build up to our peak in August of every year. That way, when the time comes, we know what all those things look like. We're used to the temperature. Used to the humidity, everything else that comes into play with those things. Even things like vacation and holidays and all those things that can not necessarily interrupt training, but can definitely make training a little bit more difficult to work around. Like I imagine Winter Olympic trainings is a lot more difficult because you have all those things that coincide and can be a distraction. But yeah, just a little sidebar that I imagine almost everybody probably has to do somewhat of a dual peak for a lot of the sports, but I'm not sure if that applies to all of them. I have no clue, honestly.
Yeah, I'm not sure either. But no, I would definitely agree. I would definitely agree. There's obviously just like some CrossFit Games athletes that like can go win nationals without actually peaking. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But like for a majority of those athletes, they're going to have to peak multiple times. You know, pretty interesting. I think that honestly, that was really good. I think a lot of people kind of can come away with that come away from this and just having some different thoughts and observations around how that would be. And now honestly, part of the reason I also wanted to do this talk was just for athletes and coaches to be able to understand that like you either want as an athlete, you either really want truly long-term gains or you don't, right? And it's like if you're someone who is constantly looking to PR and constantly look better and like constant gratification, like you're just in the wrong sport because this sport doesn't allow you to compete at a high level and have those things. Like there needs to be seasons, there needs to be long and term planning, and it's going to take a lot of time. And for most people to make the CrossFit Games, if you are a very good athlete coming into the sport, it's going to take at least 4 years at this point. The days of coming in and being able to be a games athlete in 1 to 2 years are far, far, far gone. If you can make it in 4 years now, in my opinion, you're an absolute stud, like absolute stud across the board. So if you're someone who's younger and you're like, I want to do this, let it just accept that it's going to take that long. Like you can get closer and you can get closer and that will happen and that's great. But if you truly want to make the games, You just have to accept the fact that it's going to take you that long. And if you're not satisfied with your coach because you're not there in 2 years, like they're not the issue. That's my opinion there. Any other final thoughts for yourself, my man?
No, no, I agree. Anytime I will start with a new athlete, I always tell them that I'm always looking at long term, long term vision. Like that's my goal. Your goal is to go in and attack the workouts with the intensity that I've asked you to do those things. And if you can continue to trust me in the process, you're going to be better 6 months from now than you are, now. You'll be better a year from now than when you are 6 months in. But part of that is just having the patience and delaying that gratification early on because sometimes your base is two people. We need to build a wider base, a stronger foundation, so we can continue to build the upper trajectory of what your potential can be. And some of that isn't just done with like the sexy stuff. It's the boring, repetitious stuff of just getting stronger, building structural integrity. That way, you can at least see how far you can truly go. You just try to build it on, a shaky foundation. You're done in 6 months to a year, anyways.
I agree, dude. I agree. All right, guys. Well, hope you guys enjoyed this show. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please let us know. Until next time, later.